Hello comic fans, here's Earl Grey. Whenever I read or listen to comic reviews, the least important for me are the parts in which the stories are summarized. What I usually find much more interesting is the how and why the stories are told, the form in which they are presented. It's not so much the question who loves, betrays, or kills whom, or if there's a certain message like racists, wars, or Nazis are bad, because I knew that before. To be honest with you, I'm allergic to these kind of pointy finger messages, as I am allergic to reviews who seem just too eager to forget about the form and presentation just because the quotes on quotes of message is right. I don't say that a story with some agenda is necessarily a bad one, but the message should be wrapped nicely. As I'm usually quite indifferent to the story as in the sequence of events that are told, but excited about the different ways you can tell a story, especially since there is only a very limited amount of different stories. So I looked for a particular story to prove some points in that regard and thought of Frankenstein. The novel, written by Mary Shelley in 1818, is said to be the first science fiction story. But it has obviously some horror and romantic elements as well, for sure. And the central question or dichotomy at its core is science versus morale or science versus nature. And if you want to derive a message out of that, well, there you have it. But for now, I want to examine the different forms in which the story has been represented. In comics, of course. I have to admit that I've never read the original prose novel. I've watched one or two of the classic movies with Frankenstein and his castle, which is, by the way, already a change of the setting, since in the novel all the monster creating takes place in a big house of some professor, but not in a castle. Anyhow, I'd like to start my exploration with an adaptation by George Bess, arguably the most beautiful book that I show you today. And it's obviously the one that is the closest to the novel. Told almost entirely through captions and the gorgeous art of Bess, it uses the same elaborate frame narration of the original prose very well. We start with a report of Captain Walton, who leads a polar expedition in which he tells us how he picked up a man who seemed to be lost in the ice. Then this guy, who happens to be Victor Frankenstein, tells us his story. And then we learn through Victor's and eventually the captain's report what the monster has told Victor. So yeah, some intricate structure, and we will see some of the other adaptations pass on at least one of these frame narrations or change the structure of the story entirely. But here it's used to a good effect to pull us into the story, as George Bess uses lots of details that were excluded in the other adaptations. For an example, we learn about the origins of the monster's body. It was a body from a freak show giant, which explains his extraordinary size. Or the story of the family that unknowingly taught the monster how to speak and read. I have to say that this part is, in my opinion, probably a weak point in the original tale, because the monster learns too quick, too well. So then his language is grammatically complex and his insights are profound like his contemporary human beings, maybe even more, which is just a hard sell and unnecessary. I don't say that he just had to grunt or use two-word sentences, but anyways. Nevertheless, in George Bess' adaptation, his part in which the monster speaks about his ordeals is rather important to emphasize the human nature of the monster, which is, generally speaking, one focus of his adaptation, to show us the monster as a tortured human being. The comic that claims the most to be a true adaptation is actually one that captures the least in terms of the story, the essence and the spirit of the novel. And that is this issue of Classics Illustrated, adapted by Ruth A. Roche and illustrated by Robert Hayward Webb and Ann Brewster. It's really an odd one, especially because it almost skips the central part of the story, the creation of the monster. There's no mentioning of the most abyssal or abysmal aspects of Frankenstein's endeavors, no mentioning of stealing corpses from the cemeteries. Actually, corpses are not addressed as such directly, just as, quote on, the filth I must use to work with, quote off, in one single panel. So the most spectacular part of the novel is sacrificed to self-censorship, probably to make this comic more feasible as school literature. Instead, we get an almost kitschy frame narration circling around Victor Frankenstein and his fiancée. Much more compelling and original is Junji Ito's version. He went the other way and took big liberties to make the story even more impactful than the original novel. So for an instance, he gives us some snapshots of the key moment right in the beginning, and he doesn't shy away of all the ghastly details, quite the opposite. He indulges in them. Should be no surprise, it's Junji Ito. And while in other adaptations the monster is presented almost as a novel existence, Ito shows us a true monstrous and repugnant being, still with this certain spark of humanity, but for the most part not someone to drink a beer with. There are some subtle yet clever changes to the original plot. So, for an example, Ito doesn't include Victor's assistant Sven. When Victor Frankenstein needs help to create a female match for the monster, he uses the assistance of his friend Henry. And one of the innocent victims of the monster, the maid Justine, is not hung here, but beheaded by a guillotine. So it's possible to sew her head onto the head of Lady Monster, with a surprising outcome. Another very interesting and relatively faithful adaptation was done by Guido Crepax towards the end of his career. He was ill with multiple sclerosis, and his drawings show his fight with the sickness, being untypically crude, rough and scratchy, without the elegance and flow that made his comics so appealing. But this roughness, the lack of elegance, is a good match for the content nevertheless. The monster was brought into existence, as Kripak's lines were, by pure will. So this is for sure not Kripak's best comic, but it is a touching artifact and evidence of Kripak's never-ceasing will to create and tell stories. So far I've showed you 4 adaptations that stay more or less true to the original material, despite of the different emphasis on a certain focus in each of them. It's possible to summarize the main plot with the same words. Yet these comics are entirely different in many ways. Now I will go a step further and talk about comics that took Frankenstein as an inspiration to tell their very own stories, each of them more closely or loosely related to the characters and the world created by Mary Shelley. One of them is Frankenstein Alive Alive by Bernie Wrightson, finished after Bernie's death by Kelly Jones. They crafted a sequel to the original story. The monster has survived somehow and tries now to find his place in the world. One of these places is to be an act in a freak show, which is a very clever hint to Shelley's novel, since the body for the monster originally was taken from the corpse of a sideshow giant. I hope I don't have to underline how fantastic this comic is, most and foremost, most because of Wrightson's excellent and rich art, which gives especially the monster his very own Wrightson spin. And it becomes quite evident that Bernie Wrightson put his own personality into this monster, almost to a degree that it's some kind of alter ego of Bernie. This identification is the basis for one of my favorite superheroes, well, if you want to call Madman by Michael Allred a superhero. His Frankenstein is a creation of some friendly, freaky professor, and due to some Frankensteining, which becomes quite obvious when he puts off some of his costume. Frank Einstein, aka Madman, is actually an alter ego for Michael Allred himself. A very efficient and impactful way, actually, to show his awkwardness, his unfamiliarity with the world, the feeling to be not really something whole, but something made out of different parts, just held together by his love for his girlfriend, respectively his wife. Despite of all the colorful, funny and freaky adventures of his characters, this aspect adds always an incredibly depth to his adventures, for me at least. Obviously, much more openly and direct is Casanova Nobody Frankenstein's autobiographical approach in using Frankenstein as a character to tell his very own life with it. Well, I mean, he calls himself Frankenstein, so that's adaptation or rather identification to the highest level in any case. So his own life and the myth of Frankenstein are superposed until they became a new unity, some Frankenstein unity, in his novel How to Make a Monster, drawn by Glenn Pierce. A much different but similarly idiosyncratic adaptation by the German cartoonist Ralph König tells the story of a doctor who created a monster to be not alone in the world. And since he is gay, like his very own creator, Ralph König, he uses the corpse of some young man not only to create a friend, but a lover, which eventually, spoilers, is no success. And there are Dick Briefer's Frankenstein comics from the 40s and 50s, sometimes showing the monster as the horrifying entity almost true to the more traditional or conventional Frankenstein lore, but more often than not as a very cartoony and goofy character. Collected in Craig Joe's Volume 1 of his chilling archives of horror comics. Speaking of Goofy, to finish my little roundhouse blow, here is Goofy as Frankenstein, one part of quite a long series of Goofy albums that was published over here in Germany and I guess in many other European countries as well. I'm not so sure about the US, to be honest with you. In each of these albums, Goofy appeared either as an historical or fictional character. At least some of them were written by one Carl Howard and drawn by Hector Adolfo de Ortiaga, however he is pronounced. I guess he is a Brazilian, but I'm not so sure if he is the creator of this particular album, since the creators are not mentioned anywhere. But probably it was Howard and Ortiaga as well. All of these albums are great fun, especially the panel layouts are sometimes wild and very innovative, like you can see here. The stories are very often mere slapstick and in it for the jokes and visual gags. Especially the Frankenstein album takes just some basic elements of the novel and even more from the classic movie and runs with it to town, out of the park and beyond. So that should be it for now, even if I could go on for a while longer with comics like Battle Angel Alita or the new 52 Frankenstein from DC, with their very own spins of Frankensteining, or etc, etc. I'm actually not so sure if I've proven my point that stories are not as important as the package as the form in which they are molded. But at least I could have shown you some nice comics, I hope. Thanks for listening and watching. Goodbye.